Hello viewers, and a warm welcome to the show today. I am your host, Chef Andy, and today I'm going to be gracing the presence of a very, very important guest on the show today. I will allow her to introduce herself very briefly, but before we begin, I will of course give you an idea of what to expect for the show. We are going to be working on a very, very simple green gram, or by the local term, Ndengu. We're going to be working on some of that, and I'm also going to be showing you a very, very simple take on making a rice to go with that. But of course, before we proceed, I will allow Sylvia to introduce herself to you all and give you an idea of what she's about. So, Sylvia.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm Slyvia Wambui, but everyone at school, at home, in church, everyone calls me Sly, and I prefer Sly. And I'm very glad to be here.
Perfect. Now, Sly, maybe you can share with the viewers how you managed to be part of our show today. Maybe some of them can get an idea of how to be part of our show as well.
Oh, it's very simple. Just take your mobile phone. There's an SMS number, and it's written no charges. So you text your name, where you come from, your age, and your interests. Of course, you want to be part of the show, and you'll get a call back.
Perfect. That's actually nicely put. Now, for those of you who've just heard from Sylvia, very, very simple. As I'd mentioned, I'm always more than happy to host some of you, or rather have some of you as guests on the show. So if you do, of course, have that eager passion for being on television, or you, of course, do have a little bit of passion for food like Sylvia, you can, of course, write back to us on the Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. Do give us an idea of what exactly that you're looking at learning how to make, and we may actually select you out of many to actually be part and parcel of the show. But before I continue, I'll, of course, introduce the ingredients that we'll be working with today, just to give you an idea of what to expect. Now, from the very front, I've got 1 teaspoon of cumin powder, 1 teaspoon of dried oregano, 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, and 1 teaspoon of ginger powder. I'm also going to be incorporating 1 teaspoon of tomato paste, about 1 cube of stock cube, some butter, of course, to saute our rice in. You'll, of course, also require some white onions. You can also refer to red onions for this recipe if these are not available to you. You'll also require half a cup of some uncooked basmati rice, about 3 medium-sized tomatoes, and two peppers of any different color. I preferably like to work with red and yellow. You're also going to require some carrots and some fresh coriander leaves, some green grams, of course, that we'll be making our green gram stew with, some oil to cook with, some salt and pepper to season with, and last but not least, some water, which will aid you in cooking. But before we begin, we'll of course take this chance to give you a very, very short break to sit back and relax, and we'll catch you after a very, very short break. See you in a little while. Welcome back, viewers. For those of you who are just tuning in, we're just about finished introducing the ingredients for the dish of the day, which is a very, very simple green gram recipe with a bit of some basmati rice. And we're going to start off this very, very simple process by, of course, cooking our rice to begin with. So very, very simply, we're going to begin by turning on our gas at the back here. And now very simply, all we are going to do is continue to add our rice into the sauce pot that we're going to be cooking our rice in. Be sure to also measure out about half a teaspoon of salt. And of course, very important, always proceed to measure out about the same, double the quantity of water to your rice. Simple, eh? Perfect. Right, now we're going to allow that to continue cooking undisturbed. And while we do so, we're also going to begin to prepare the rest of the ingredients that we're going to be using for this simple recipe. So, Sly, I will ask you to grate some carrots for us.
Okay.
Now, one thing I should mention at this stage about using grated carrots, or rather working with grated ingredients, is one particular thing is it also aids in giving your food a nice, beautiful appearance. Over and above that, it also shows a bit of creativity in your cooking. So be sure to also improvise with some equipment or utensils that you have in your kitchen, because they could actually bring a nice, beautiful, vibrant finish to your dish. Now, as Sly continues to grate the carrots, I'm also going to be chopping up some onions. And while we do so, I'm also going to make it a little bit interactive, Sly. So maybe as you grate, you can give us a little bit of an idea of maybe how your holidays are going, maybe something you're looking forward to doing this particular holidays while you're at home.
Oh, okay, before we do that, I have a question. What's the difference between using red onions and these white onions?
Now, one beautiful thing about white onions is it also, it carries a nice, beautiful juiciness to it. It's not as pungent as a red onion. And another thing is also working with white onions, it won't make your eyes tear. So it's also one beautiful advantage to using white onions. Then another thing also to mention, viewers, they do also cost somewhat a little higher in pricing because of the fact that they're also very limited in availability. So you may of course find on some occasions white onions may not be easy to find, and red onions are probably easier to find. So what happens is I like to improvise with white onions once in a while, just of course to make sure that the dish also has a beautiful difference in flavor, and also it also looks a little bit appealing in appearance. But there's not really much difference, viewers. For those of you who are of course wondering, there's not really much difference, but there is a very, very big point that I should share. Remember, there is very many varieties of onions in the market. You can use spring onions, you can use leeks, you can use celery as well. All these beautiful onions all add a nice, beautiful, beautiful advantage and flavor to your dish. So be sure to, of course, go out there and buy and purchase a few, try them at home, and you'll be able to see the characteristic of each one. Another thing also to mention, white onions are also good when you're making salads. So they actually, it won't give you that aftertaste of onion like a red onion does, especially like if you're making a kachumbari. So you'll find that a white onion will have a nice, more subtle flavor. The red one will, of course, be very strong. Yeah. Right, so we're going to start off the process by chopping finely some white onions. Now, I also wanted to find out, Sly, what particular flavors do you look at when you're having green grams or when you're making dengu at home?
I love putting a lot of spice. Like, I'll put in many spicy things. I like it smelling nice.
A good, nice aroma to it.
And it must have a little like a stew to mix with the rice.
Okay.
Well.
So it shouldn't be too dry, of course.
Okay,
Not too thick.
Yeah.
Perfect. Now, we're going to be making a very, very similar thing to what you're looking at. I'll, of course, try and make sure to incorporate all those beautiful flavors of spice. But, of course, as I always mention on the show, viewers at home, it is, of course, very important that I mention at this stage that we don't, of course, insist that you copy-paste the same exact recipes that we use on the show. You can, of course, add your own small bit of touch to it by, of course, using very, very many different varieties of spices that are available to you in your marketplace. And of course, you can also go a little harder on the spices, especially if you're looking at making something really, really spicy, or if you're looking at something and you want it to be very, very hot, you can, of course, proceed to add a little more of the chili or a little more of the spices, and this will, of course, give it a nice, beautiful kick. Now, something, Sly, I always wanted to find out, especially from people or students that are on holiday. What are particular things that maybe you find hard when cooking at home? Is there particular challenges you encounter maybe when you're making or trying something at home on your own?
Yeah, many challenges. Like if a dish has to boil, I'm like, okay, how many minutes?
Okay.
Yeah, so I just guess, I'm like, let's do with 2, because 2 is most standard. So I do 2 minutes. The ingredients, mostly I like copy paste. You've discouraged it, but I do it.
Okay.
I copy paste recipes. So when I copy paste, there's turmeric, there's cinnamon. I'm like, we don't have those in
We
our
don't
house.
have this in the house.
So what will I use as an alternative? It's a challenge.
So what particular ingredients have you struggled to find substitutes for? Maybe one particular one that you remember, this one I couldn't find and it made it impossible for me to work with.
Like there was a dish, the chef used this yellow pepper. And I was like, can I use green pepper? Will it have the same taste? The same appeal? So I was like, okay, I won't try it, but I tried it and it was basically the same, just the color.
Just the color.
Yeah.
Now, one particular thing maybe I can share with you on the show today. Any particular time you find a recipe maybe that looks interesting and you want to try out, one tip I can share with you is you can of course always maybe scroll to the bottom of the recipe. On some occasions there is recipes that you may find that they may be added a section that they maybe say you can use this alternative to this. But of course, for some of you watching as well, I do know there are recipes out there that don't really give you the leeway to have alternative ingredients to use on them. But what I would normally insist is if you get a recipe, what I like to do is I like to break it 3 times. So what I do is maybe I'll say I'll try it this month, and then maybe in 2 months, and then maybe in 3 months. And then what I do is I always record everything that I used. And of course, because we of course humans, we relate more with our taste buds. We always have a better sense of memory, especially when you taste something good. So what I would recommend is maybe have a notebook with you. So what happens is when you take your recipe down, write it down, and then the next time you try it, take the same recipe and maybe change one thing on the recipe and see what happens. So, and of course, very important to mention something as well that you should remember. Please don't try it when you're cooking for a big number.
Right.
Try it when you're alone in the house. So what happens is you will of course realize and you'll of course discover more knowledge on ingredients. Another thing as well, you can of course maybe after trying out a recipe, maybe share it with friends or try and cook it for your mom and dad at home. See the feedback they give you, because on most occasions the feedback that people give you directly is pretty much more helpful than the feedback that you give yourself. So what happens is you can also be using maybe some guinea pigs in your house. Maybe grab 2-3 friends that you're close with. Make a small portion of the dish and maybe split the ingredients 3 ways. So maybe if you're using 1 onion, maybe cut it into 4 quarters and maybe use a little bit of this recipe here, this one here, this one here. Then what happens is it's basically called a blind tasting. So what you do is you'd put these items that you prepared in front of the guests or the people that you want them to try. And it'll be very easy. They'll probably tell you maybe you should have added this and avoided the other. And that's basically how you continue to perfect the recipe. So it's a very, very simple technique. And then of course on the side that you also mentioned, availability of ingredients. That one particularly is never going to be much easier than I can say it. Of course, for those of you watching as well, you may of course have encountered situations whereby you're very eager to cook or try something at home, but you walk into your vegetable vendor, you walk into your supermarket, you actually walk in and it's frustrating. Yeah? When they actually look you in the face and they tell you, we don't have that.
And you search the whole market.
And you've looked for it for a while. So something I can also recommend, on occasion I also like to maybe Google the ingredients. Of course now it is a little easier now in the city because if you live within the city, some shops will maybe even air out the items that they are selling. So what you can probably do is maybe Google the ingredient and add supplier. It may give you some place that you may be able to find it. And then of course the only other left solution to this particular issue would basically maybe be moving around different markets. So maybe try a different market from where you shop on a regular basis And then of course also another pointer to share, you can also put a reminder on maybe market days or days that there's maybe vendors that, or maybe like organic market days. So on those particular dates, particularly here in the city, you'll realize that more farmers will come out with their produce, and you may actually be able to find more ingredients than you expected. But of course, for some of you watching as well, remember, as I mentioned on the show, I will try my very best to always make it easier for you to have an idea of what you can substitute with the recipes that we use on the show, because I know it is, of course, very challenging to take a recipe down and then source for the ingredients, and you particularly find it very impossible to.
Right. I had a question. These are peppers, right? So can't you just use like, okay, black pepper? What's black pepper?
Now, black pepper is a particular, it's a particular, it actually is sourced as a spice. On occasion, you may actually not be able to find black pepper powder or black pepper corns in the market. They're also very scarce in the market. But what happens is the peppercorn that is a particular family of the pepper, it's the only particular pepper that we use that's not actually a vegetable. So you will find red pepper out there, yellow pepper, and green bell pepper. Those particular peppers also range in the pepper family, but of course, due to the fact that there's very different varieties of it, you will find that there's peppers that are more to the sweeter side, like the red and the yellow. You get a blander pepper that's a green kind, which is of course very bland. It's not sweet, it's not savory. And then you of course get peppers that are out there that are particularly just the seeds. We don't actually use a plant for that particular basis. So what you'd encounter is black pepper is mostly the same product that is used to make black pepper powder. And what happens is you may be able to of course find such tools as a pepper mill, which of course make it easier to grind your pepper. But you can of course also use it as a whole corn as it is, or you can also grind it. So very, very simple explanation for that. You can of course also do some research online. You will be able to find a very, very big array of peppers like pimentos. There's so many different varieties out there, but as I mentioned, some of them may not be available to you near where you're staying or where you shop. But of course, by looking around, you may be able to find many more varieties, yeah? Cool. Of course, now just to finish off preparing our vegetables, I'm also going to take a bit of my red pepper. Now, the peppers I'm using for the recipe in front of us at the moment, these are particularly very good in giving your rice a bit of color. So these are basically, I'm going to be sauteing this in the rice.
In the rice?
Yes. And you'll be able to see the difference in color once this is done. We're also going to be working on a very, very simple green gram recipe as well. For those of you who are still watching, we are going to be making a very, very simple and cost-effective green gram recipe that most of you can be able to try at home. Now, of course, at this stage, I will proceed to turn off my heat on this end. The rice is nicely, beautifully fluffy and cooked. So I'm just going to let that sit on the side. Then, of course, we will proceed to add the next ingredient or begin the first process of the next ingredient, which is our green grams. So very, very simply, I'm going to begin by adding about 2 cups of water into a pan. And we're basically just going to turn that on and allow the water to come to the simmer. And what we're going to do next is we're basically going to add our green grams once the water comes to the boil. Very important to also mention, always add a bit of seasoning to your water. And of course, once that comes to the boil, we will of course add our green grams or our ndengu. We'll allow them to cook really, really quickly. But of course, I will incorporate this into the dish a little later. So we will of course take a very short break and allow those to continue cooking. But when you do come back, I will show you what they look like, or rather the result of after cooking for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we will of course go into the next process of cooling and sauteing with the rest of the ingredients to make a very, very simple and hearty green gram stew. So please don't touch that down. We'll be right back. Welcome back, viewers. For those of you who are just tuning in, we've pretty much finished the first process of cooking for our rice. We're right about at the last and final stage of the first cooking process of our green grams. So these have basically been cooking for anywhere between 25 to 30 minutes on a regular cooking pot. You can, of course, cut that time by half by using a pressure cooker if you have one available to you. A little bit noisy on the cons end, but of course very, very important tool to have at home. Now, as of course these are pretty much almost fully cooked, we're of course not going to cook them fully. So this should actually be able to press very simply. This is one simple check I like to use. I normally just press them with a spoon, and if it can actually almost become almost grainy but not very, very soft, this of course gives you the idea to remove. So on that notion that you had mentioned earlier about being able to know when they are ready, I would always suggest maybe try make it once and then record the time. It's always easier to remember that way. Another thing is you can always take just one piece from the mixture, especially for beans and such things as dengu. Just press with a spoon. If you can be able to mash it very simply, that means you can actually stop at this stage so that you'll cool them off, and then you'll actually now be able to cook it into the stew a little later. So now very, very simply, we are going to proceed to drain this in the sink. So I'm going to allow you to do that for us. So what you're going to do is you're going to pour them into the strainer at the sink, and then pour a bit of water on top of them, and then we're just going to allow them to sit on top of the same pot once they're in the sieve, just to allow them to cool off. Simple, yeah? Right, so as Sly continues to do that, I'll of course take you to the next step of the dish. So remember, we are going to be turning this into a very, very simple stew. So for that, we're going to be using a few of the ingredients we chopped up a little earlier, which is a bit of the white onions and some tomatoes, a bit of the carrots, and of course some of the spices that I had at the back a little earlier. Right, perfect. Now, of course, very important to mention when you're draining your ingredients, very, very handy tool to have in the kitchen, such as a sieve. You can, of course, allow this to, it actually allows for you to get them to cool a little faster because it gives a bit of room underneath so air can easily circulate. And it's basically simple as that. Very, very handy tool, especially if you're looking for ways to cool off your ingredients a little faster or drain ingredients that have a bit of water that you need to remove. Right, so very, very simple. Once that's done, we're going to transfer that into a bowl. So I'm just going to use a regular plate on the side to transfer those. Right, once that's done, you can discard your sieve. Right, simple as that. Now our next step is, of course, to make our very, very simple our dengu stew. So I'm going to just use the same pot that we used for the dengu. Very, of course, important to make sure to try and also save yourself when doing dishes. I know it's something most of our young cooks at home do not pleasure to do. So it's a very, very simple trick as well. If you're going to cook the same thing in the same pot, you can actually just wipe it down and continue. But of course, if you are going to be, if of course you have a bit of scum or some of that white stuff that sits on the side of your pot, you can of course go back to the sink and wash it out. But one particular technique or point to note that I picked up, especially when working with pulses, you can of course soak them overnight in some water. That will of course aid in cooking them a little faster. You can of course make sure to rinse them in some cold water as well before boiling. That will of course get rid of that whitish stuff that floats on the top, which we refer to as scum. Those are particularly very, very good tips that I've learned over the period of working with the green grams. So we're going to start off the next process very simple. And we're going to begin, of course, by heating up a pan. Now we're going to be frying up some of the ingredients that we'll be adding to this, which is, of course, some of our white onions. So before, of course, beginning that process, we'll add a bit of oil. Now, I don't know what kind of oil do you like to use at home?
We use golden fry.
Golden fry, it's a very beautiful vegetable oil.
Most preferred.
Most preferred one. Now, one particular thing I like to mention as well when working with the different oils, there is many varieties of oils that are out there, but stick with vegetable oil. It's always a little bit easier and cheaper to afford. But if you're looking at being very fancy, you can of course use such oils as infused oils like hazelnut oil and all those other ones. But olive oil is also a very good alternative, and it's also a little bit healthier. The only problem with olive oil is the fact that it costs a little higher.
Does it enhance the taste in the food?
Yes, olive oil enhances the taste in the food, and many of the other oils as well do the same. Vegetable oil is particularly very good in that it will not infuse any particular flavors, so it's very good especially if you're looking at infusing your own flavors to the dish. All right, so we're going to be adding just about 3/4 of our onions, and I'm using chopped white onions for this recipe. So using a spoon, proceed to mix those through in the pot.
Is there a difference between using a spoon and a wooden spoon?
No, you can actually use any that you feel that is to your liking is very good. But I will of course mention one particular thing about using such some of these heat-proof options. They actually allow for you to be able to somewhat be able to actually one point I can share as well is you'll realize when cooking with wooden spoons, your spoon will always get a bit of a color or will also touch a bit of a flavor. So normally for wooden spoons, I like to use them when doing sautés of such stuff as meat, because of course one particular thing that you'll realize with wooden spoons is it's very easy to contaminate other dishes, because you can't really wash inside the bit of wood, and it also get a bit of aroma. So one particular thing I'll mention is if you're using these, the plastic variety, they're very good in that it doesn't also change color or it doesn't hold on to the flavor. But of course, for those of you who are looking at using different kinds of spoons at home, there are also ceramic ones that are available in the market. There are also melamine ones that they look like plastic, but they're also heat proof. So you can actually be able to use any of them. But I'll of course recommend, if you're going to be using wooden spoons, maybe use it for stew and meat dishes, because of the fact that it can easily contaminate.
Is it always safe to use like an eating spoon to like?
Well, it is allowed to use a spoon of that nature to cook with. But of course, always remember one particular problem with using such stainless steel spoons is it actually scratches the bottom of your cooking pot. So what happens is plastic or melamine or wooden spoons are advised, because they'll of course not scratch the bottom of your pan. By using stainless steel ones, you actually scratch your pan and you actually damage it. So it's the only big advantage of being able to use plastic or wooden over stainless steel ones. So you'll normally realize, even when working with such cooking pots as cooking spoons as stainless steel, you may of course maybe on many occasions encounter using them maybe like in a buffet or when serving, because they're not of course going to scratch the dishes that you're going to be serving with. And then another thing is for the fact that they also catch heat very quickly. I think you've seen it on occasion where you may have to grab a cloth and maybe you're afraid of touching. So the beautiful advantage of using wooden ones, or such as the ones we're using today, they don't conduct heat, which means you don't have to be afraid of touching them every time you need to go back to the pot. But another thing, if you're still restricted to using that method, always have maybe a plate on the side, so that after mixing all the ingredients, you can actually put it aside and it will not conduct heat. Yeah. Any other questions?
I'll ask. Perfect.
All right, so as we continue, I'll also allow you to chop up some of the tomatoes for us. So as she continues to chop up the tomatoes, I will of course continue to incorporate the rest of the ingredients that we had mentioned a little earlier. I'm just going to move them forward. Right, so very simply, we'll begin by adding our garlic powder and our ginger powder. I'm also going to add my dried oregano at this stage and my cumin powder. And basically this is just to give it a nice beautiful aroma. You may of course notice at this stage that your pan may be a bit dry, so do feel free to add just a little bit of oil. This is of course to also aid in making sure that your spices are nicely cooked down. So once that is mixed through, proceed to just add a bit of water. And the water will basically do two things. It's going to aid in making sure that your spices are able to mix very, very evenly with the onions. Also allows for the flavors to come through. The water also aids in rinsing down the sides of your cooking pot, making sure that the flavors are nicely concentrated at the bottom part of your dish and not on the sides. Now, something I also want to ask Sly is, on this particular holidays that you get breaks from school, do you take time to cook a lot at home?
Yes, I do.
So you engage yourself in the kitchen quite a bit.
I'm like the chef of the house.
All right. What are the particular favorites for you at the moment? What do you love to cook, or what's your star dish in the kitchen?
My star dish now is ugali and sukuma wiki. Yeah.
Nice and simple, eh? Are you looking at learning or trying some different options while you're on your school holidays?
Yes, I am. Because ugali sukuma wiki is boring, and when you tell my mom, she's like, "Do you have another dish in mind?" You're like, "No." Then cook.
Well, I know it is a challenge, especially when you're at home, and well, our parents being the parents that they are, I'm just going to add about half our cube. On many occasions, our parents do keep us very restricted to our options based on the budgetary factor to it.
Yeah.
But you will, of course, in the later stages in life, you will, of course, grow up and you'll one day come to understand why mom insisted on that ugali and sukuma wiki. Right, as we continue, I'm just going to add my tomato paste at this stage.
Chef, is it advised to measure salt using you see, there are people who put salt in cans. Yeah, like cocoa cans, chocolate cans and stuff. Is it advised to measure the salt using the top of that can?
What do you mean, like the lid?
Yeah, the lid, yeah.
Well, one particular problem is with measuring ingredients in that fashion. You may of course not be able to get it in exactly the same amount or the precise amount that is on your recipe. So you'll realize, like, if for instance this was a lid, you'll realize some lids are bigger or smaller, but you see a teaspoon is only limited to 5 ml. So what happens is, if you use a bigger lid, you can't be able to tell when you've gone past the 5. But with a spoon that's already standardized, you can of course be able to tell half a spoon, a quarter of a spoon. So we as chefs, we prefer to use a spoon, because whichever country you go out there or whichever continent you're in, the standard measure for a spoon doesn't change. It may change in appearance or maybe on coating, but the standardized, just like the regular spoon that you have when you're eating your dinner spoon. You see, if that spoon got bigger, you may not be able to fit it in your mouth. But
right.
It's designed to fit in that particular size because it measures a certain amount, which means you can also be able to get the correct amount of food in your system every time you get onto your plate. So one particular thing I will share with you home viewers as well, it's also a very nice question. For some of you who are thinking of using maybe the lids of containers or spice containers that you use, I'll recommend using spoons because they'll give you a standard measure. But of course, if you're feeling confident and maybe you've tried the recipe over and over again, maybe you can take a chance in adding your ingredients without measuring. But of course, if you're looking at being very consistent with your dishes, and you remember, for some of us who are cooking at home, you're also trying to make sure that you're also on budget. So sometimes you may realize that adding too much spice in a dish may first of all not make the dish any better. It'll actually maybe change the taste, and first you'll hate the dish, and second of all, you can't also go back to the dish and remove the ingredients that were in there. You may have to start from the beginning, or you'll have to serve a bad dinner for that day. So one particular thing I'll always recommend, always try and make sure to keep a nice, beautiful standard or procedure of cooking, in that you may, of course, be very particular in maybe making sure that the cost factor does not change. Remember, you may buy 100 grams of spices, for instance, and you want it to last you for 6 months. But if you don't use 1 teaspoon each time, you may realize it's over by the 2nd month, and now you have to figure out how to get more spice for the other 4 months that are remaining. So what I'll always recommend, if you're using recipes, use a spoon. But if it is, of course, a recipe that you've tried so many times and you're sure about it, then you can, of course, you can trust you. That's the best way to put it, actually. Right, now as you can be able to see, you can see it's also now become almost a pasty consistency. Very important. You can also
Appealing.
get the spices coming through.
Yeah.
Now, one particular thing I've learned over making such dishes as lentils or dengu, you'll realize by adding too much water at this stage, you may actually evaporate most of the flavor. So what I like to do is I like to add little bits of water. So pretty much not enough water to go maybe as high into or almost half the size of the pot, but just enough water for the liquid to be able to bubble at the bottom. So one tip I can also share with you and those watching at home, always add a little bit of water as you continue cooking, or if you have maybe some vegetable stock, you can also add a little bit at a time. When what happens is this helps you to concentrate the flavor as opposed to adding so much water and everything boils away. And what happens is the effectiveness of all your spices disappears. Right. Right, so now we're going to continue to finish off this very, very simple sauce that we made. I think you can be able to see it from the cameras. It should also be almost gravy-like at this stage. Of course, by cooking your spices down on some low heat, nice and slow, also allows for a good, more profound flavor coming through. We are, of course, going to be adding some tomatoes to this. So I'm just going to begin by grabbing some of the tomatoes from the board. And you can, of course, be able to incorporate tomatoes of any particular type. You can, of course, use cherry tomatoes for this recipe, or you can also use just your regular whole tomatoes. But one thing you can be able to achieve by using cherry tomatoes, they do add a nice, beautiful sweetness to the dish. So you can, of course, be able to try this out on your own, and you may, of course, be able to pick out some of the beautiful aspects of this very, very rare ingredient.
Can you use tomato paste on this?
Yes, we actually use some tomato paste in this. So one beautiful thing about a tomato paste, it brings a beautiful balance of the flavors, and it also enriches the flavor of the dish. Yeah. So as Sly continues to work through to the last and final part of those tomatoes, we're going to raise our heat. We've been cooking this, of course, at low heat just to be able to get the intensity of the spices. So I'm, of course, going to raise my temperature a little higher to medium. And this is basically to aid in making sure that we break up the tomatoes a little faster through the cooking process. We are, of course, also going to be sauteing our rice very, very quickly. So I'm also going to place a fresh pan onto the counter.
I put this.
Yes, you can actually add those in here. Nice and simple. Perfect. Right, so as we continue to cook our tomatoes, giving them about 4 to 5 minutes to just blister and, of course, incorporate with the mixture. We are, of course, also going to be sauteing some rice. So I'm going to begin by heating up a pan, and you can be able to use a shallow pan for this technique.
You know, when I saw you putting the rice in the water, I remembered my mom usually measures with her eyes. She's like, this will be the right amount, and I'm like, wow, you're a genius.
No, but now you've pretty much understood and you can be able to see once you measure everything out, you can actually be able to hold your rice to the side. Your water is completely absorbed. And this is this is basically what we were discussing a little earlier. If most people actually took time in using spoons and cups to measure, cooking would be so easy. But what you'll realize, Sly, over the period of time that people do cook at home, sometimes you're also pressed for time and maybe also not very particular on what you're making. You'll realize there's people who just throw ingredients into the pan. And as I mentioned, you can of course take your chance and do so only if you're sure and maybe you've tried that recipe a few times. But I always recommend, if you're pretty much not aware or very certain about how much you need to add at a particular stage, I always say just pretty much use a recipe book. It'll always give you the tips. And on this modern day, of course, we also have YouTube videos that can also aid in making sure that you're able to pretty much grasp and find very, very simple and easy recipes to work with. I'll, of course, always recommend stick with your cups and your spoons. You'll never go wrong. And of course, it also aids in making sure that you can also reproduce the same dish over and over again. Because if you measure it from the eye, maybe today you are feeling generous and you decided to add too much. You may, of course, regret it at the end, and it may be too late to start the dish from the beginning. All right. Now, as our tomatoes continue to cook down, I will, of course, ask you to come to this side of the counter. And you're going to be helping us very simply in making our fried rice. So I'm just going to add a bit of oil to the pan. And I'm also going to be adding a bit of butter. So I'm going to add about 1 teaspoon of butter. So basically what this does is going to give the rice a nice, beautiful flavor.
The butter?
Exactly. Also gives it a nice, beautiful, silky texture. So I'll begin by just working the butter around the pan. And I'll give that back to you. So to make that very simple fried rice, we're going to begin by adding some onions. And you can continue to mix that through. I'm also going to be adding my yellow bell peppers and my red bell pepper. So Sly, as I mentioned a little earlier, it's a very, very simple technique of giving your rice a beautiful appearance. Also aids in giving it a nice, beautiful flavor. So of course, to aid us in giving all that in there, we're going to crack in a few black peppercorns.
Can't wait to see the end come.
Pardon?
Can't wait to see the end result.
The end result,
yeah,
yes,
of the
it'll be
rice.
very colorful. Then of course a small pinch of salt. Of course, be very careful when adding salt as well to make sure that you don't add too much salt. So I used very little salt in the beginning of the cooking of the rice. And then the rest of the salt I pretty much added at this stage. Right, so basically all you need to do at this stage now is continue to saute your vegetables for anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. Remember, you're of course not trying to overcook your vegetables. This is of course basically going to give them a nice, beautiful flavor. It's also going to allow them to really allow for the juices to escape, which is of course also going to infuse your rice very, very nicely. Right, now as we of course come to the last and final part of the dish, we're of course going to proceed to plating right after this. So as Sly continues to mix the rest of our ingredients, I'm also going to be adding my green grams to the mixture that we started with second. And remember, these were pretty much cooked to done stage. So all you need to do is always remember at this stage when you're adding your pulses or any particular cooked grains to a mixture that you're cooking already, always make sure that it's not, of course, going to take too much time to finish off once you add it to your mixture that is in front of you. And of course, making sure that it's fully cooked as well. Make sure that you're also not going to overcook the dish once you come to the combining and last stage of the cooking process. And of course, very, very important, also have a little bit of water to always add to your mixture, or as well a bit of some vegetable or meat stock that you can be able to add to your pot, just of course to aid in making sure that your mixture cooks nice and evenly. Now of course our peppers are nicely colored. We're going to proceed to add our rice. So I'm going to begin by breaking down or breaking up the rice in the pot. Very important to make sure that you also don't add oil when making fried rice, because it's going to be too much at the end. So as you notice, this rice is going to be very grainy and dry, as you can see. And we're just going to add that into our frying pan. Right, now you're just going to keep mixing that. We're going to be doing that on low heat, of course, just to make sure we don't also overcook the mixture.
Is there a difference between simmering and stirring?
Yes, simmering refers to the cooking. Stirring is basically what you're doing now. So simmering would basically be, simmering is actually, we refer to it as a simmering point in cooking. So you know, once you put water in your pan or in your pot and you start boiling it, the point where the bubbles start playing on the surface, we call that simmering point. So when we say simmer, we basically mean bring the liquid to a point where it's going to bubble, like what we're doing with the green grams now. So it's a very, very simple terminology. It only refers to the process of
Water bubble.
not only water, but any particular liquid. So it could be soup, it could be a
Even
sauce,
this
maybe.
simmering.
Even this is simmering, yeah. So just remember, simmering, of course, means you're pretty much cooking at a constant heat, so the heat won't change. And basically, the main thing or what the visual appearance of simmering would basically be the bubbles on the top of your liquid. Yeah. Right, so as we come to the last and final part of this cooking process, and the green grams are nicely puffed up, we're going to proceed to add a bit of our grated carrot. So I'm going to add about 3/4 cup, just to make sure we get a nice even balance. Of course, always also remember to add any particular such ingredients such as grated carrot to your mixture towards the very end. Remember, this will of course cook much faster than chopped up carrot. And also be very wary to make sure when making any particular saucy or stewy dishes, always make sure to also get a nice beautiful balance of color to your dish. So make sure that you don't have, of course, too much of one ingredient. Otherwise your plate could actually look very, very unbalanced. But we are of course going to take the rice out now. So I'm just going to turn the heat off completely. Just continue mixing it a little bit. So as she continues to finish off the rice, I am of course going to take this chance to take another very, very quick break just to clear up our stations. But when we do come back, we'll proceed to the plating. I'll be able to show you what the green grams look like, and of course give you some very, very simple serving suggestions. So please don't touch that dial. We'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back, viewers. If you're just tuning in, you pretty much missed out on everything we did today. But remember, you can be able to recap on this and more through our YouTube channel. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya, where you will be able to recap on this and many other different recipes that we've covered in this particular show, in the recent past, of course. Now we have, of course, come to the last part of the plating. So Sly, I think we can proceed to plate a bit of rice there, put a nice decent portion that you can finish. And as she does so, I'm also going to proceed to turn off the heat on our ndengu completely. Proceed to give it a very, very quick mixture before, of course, also proceeding to move that onto the plate. Simple as that. Now, very, very important, always, of course, give a nice, beautiful finish to every dish with a bit of a garnish. So for that, I'm going to be chopping up some fresh coriander. About a teaspoon worth should do. Thank you. Now, of course, very important before we convince our viewers that this is actually going to be tasty, I would like you to give the rice a bit of a taste.
Okay.
Just to give us an idea of what you think. Nice and light. How's the peppers?
They are awesome. There's
Nice
a
and
taste.
soft and
Yeah.
flavory, sweet, yeah?
Yeah. There's no white rice. Plain.
Uh-huh.
As in I can feel the change. Yeah.
So now you can be able to try this at home.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Sweet.
All right, now I'm going to just finish off this dengu of ours. Just going to garnish it simple as that with a bit of some fresh coriander. And that is as simple as our rice and dengu is.
Wow.
Yeah,
Awesome.
thank you. Now, of course, very important that you also give the dengu a try. Right, so pretty much give it a taste. Tell us what you think. Maybe if we over seasoned, if we under seasoned, something you'd change, something you'd add.
It's okay,
Uh-huh.
but for me, I wouldn't do the garnishing on top.
Uh-huh.
You know, we believe in the boiling of the dania.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the only difference you change is, of course, not having the dania on top of the dish, but in the dish.
Yeah.
Perfect.
But it's okay. It's cool. It's sweet.
Perfect. So, of course, ladies and gentlemen, with that said and done, we have, of course, come to the last and final part of the show. I have, of course, had the pleasure, of course, of having Sly on the show today, and I hope you've had some fun as well.
Yeah, I've learned a lot.
You've learned
like,
something new, yeah? And you
much.
can be able to try this at home now.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we, of course, are going to bid you farewell at this stage, thanking you once again for tuning in with us this far. But I will, of course, remind you that you can be able to reach back to us with your comments, your queries, or any particular suggestions through writing to us through our Facebook page. That's BrandPlus TV Kenya. And of course, if you missed out on this or many of our other previous episodes, you can, of course, recap on that as well through our YouTube channel. That is BrandPlus TV Kenya as well. But from my end, I will wish you a very, very beautiful evening, God's blessings, and until the next time we see each other, do have a lovely evening, and bye-bye.